The room is quiet, not the awkward kind of quiet, not the kind that presses against your ears and makes you self-conscious, but the kind that feels like a deep breath finally released. For some people, this moment is uncomfortable. For others, it feels like coming home. And if you're someone who prefers being alone, you've probably noticed how often the world misunderstands that feeling. People ask if you're lonely. They assume you're sad, antisocial, broken, or hiding from something. But what if the truth is far more interesting than that? What if the psychology of people who prefer being alone reveals not a weakness, but a distinct way of experiencing reality, processing emotion, and finding meaning? From the outside, solitude looks empty. From the inside, it's full of thoughts that don't get drowned out, full of emotions that have room to unfold without interruption, full of a sense of autonomy that feels rare in a world constantly asking for attention, responses, explanations. People who prefer being alone aren't running away from life. In many cases, they're running toward it, just on their own terms. And understanding why changes how you see not only them, but yourself. One of the first things psychology reveals is that preference for solitude is not the same as social anxiety or isolation. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Social anxiety is driven by fear of judgment, rejection, or embarrassment. Isolation is often imposed, not chosen. But the people we're talking about here choose aloneness. They step into it willingly, even eagerly, because something inside them responds to it. Their nervous system calms down, their mind sharpens, their sense of self becomes clearer. Solitude for them is regulation, not avoidance. This often begins early in life. Many people who prefer being alone recall childhood moments where being by themselves felt natural. They could play for hours, imagine entire worlds, read endlessly, or simply sit and think without boredom creeping in. While other children sought constant stimulation or group validation, these individuals found richness in internal experience. Psychology suggests that this early comfort with solitude is linked to a strong internal locus of control. They learn early that their inner world is a reliable place, a place where meaning doesn't depend on external approval. As they grow older, this trait often deepens. Alone time becomes not just a preference, but a necessity. After social interaction, they feel drained, not because they dislike people, but because their cognitive and emotional processing runs deep. Conversations aren't just noise, they're data. Facial expressions, tones, unspoken implications, emotional shifts, all of it gets absorbed. That level of processing is mentally expensive. Solitude is how the mind recovers, integrates, and resets. Without it, these individuals feel scattered, overstimulated, disconnected from themselves. There's a misconception that people who prefer being alone lack social skills. In reality, many of them are highly perceptive socially. They notice subtleties others miss. They sense tension before it's spoken. They understand motives beneath words. But because they see so much, they're selective about engagement. Small talk feels hollow. Surface-level interactions feel exhausting. They don't want more conversations. They want meaningful ones. And when those are rare, solitude becomes the more honest option. Another psychological layer reveals something even deeper. People who prefer being alone often have a strong sense of identity. They are less dependent on external feedback to know who they are. Their values aren't constantly recalibrated based on group opinion. This doesn't mean they're stubborn or closed-minded. It means their self-concept is internally anchored. When you spend time alone regularly, you confront your own thoughts without distraction. You notice contradictions. You wrestle with doubt. You refine your beliefs. Over time, this creates a self that feels coherent, even if it doesn't always align with the crowd. This internal anchoring also explains why such people are often resistant to social pressure. They don't feel the same urgency to conform. Trends pass them by. Popular opinions don't automatically become their own. They're not trying to be different. They simply don't feel the same pull to belong at any cost. Belonging, for them, must be authentic, or it isn't worth much. And if you're recognizing yourself in this, you might already feel that quiet relief of being seen. If you want to keep exploring these hidden psychological patterns, staying connected here is a way of signaling that curiosity matters to you. Emotionally, people who prefer being alone experience feelings with intensity and nuance. They don't skim the surface of emotion, they dive. Happiness isn't just excitement, it's meaning. Sadness isn't just pain, it's information. Because of this, they often need space to process what they feel. Crowded environments and constant interaction interrupt that process. Solitude gives emotions time to complete their arc instead of being suppressed or rushed. This is why alone time often feels healing to them. It's emotional digestion. There's also a strong link between solitude preference and creativity. When the mind isn't reacting to external input, it begins to connect internal dots. Ideas cross-pollinate. Memories resurface. Imagination stretches. Many people who prefer being alone aren't trying to be creative. Creativity emerges naturally from their mental environment. Their thoughts have room to echo, collide, and evolve. This doesn't only apply to artists or writers, it applies to problem solvers, strategists, thinkers of all kinds. Solitude becomes the laboratory of the mind. Yet despite these strengths, people who prefer being alone often carry a quiet burden. They're constantly navigating a world designed for extroversion. Open offices, group projects, networking events, social expectations framed as obligations. Saying, "I need time alone" is often interpreted as rejection or disinterest. Over time, this creates pressure to perform sociability, to explain oneself, to justify a perfectly natural preference. Psychologically, this can lead to a sense of being misunderstood, even when surrounded by people. That misunderstanding sometimes pushes these individuals further inward, not because they dislike others, but because explaining themselves becomes tiring. It's easier to retreat than to constantly defend a way of being that feels obvious from the inside. This is where solitude shifts from preference to refuge. And while refuge isn't inherently unhealthy, the line between restorative solitude and protective withdrawal can blur. The healthiest versions of solitude are chosen freely, not used to hide from unresolved fear or pain. Interestingly, many people who prefer being alone are deeply empathetic. They feel others' emotions strongly, sometimes too strongly. This sensitivity makes social environments emotionally loud. Solitude quiets that noise. It allows them to separate their own feelings from those they absorb. In this sense, being alone isn't about selfishness. It's about boundaries. It's about preserving emotional clarity in a world that constantly bleeds feelings across invisible lines. Another psychological trait often present is a high tolerance for ambiguity. People who enjoy solitude are comfortable sitting with unanswered questions. They don't rush to fill silence with certainty. They can exist in the in-between, where ideas are still forming and emotions aren't fully named. This comfort with ambiguity makes them reflective, philosophical, and sometimes misunderstood. Others may interpret their pauses as disengagement, when in reality they're thinking deeply. Time also feels different to people who prefer being alone. Without constant external scheduling, time becomes elastic. Hours can pass unnoticed while reading, thinking, or creating. This altered relationship with time contributes to their resistance to overstimulation. When your inner world is rich, you don't need constant novelty. You need depth, and depth requires stillness. There's a quiet confidence that often emerges in those who truly embrace solitude. Not loud, not performative, but steady. It comes from knowing you can be with yourself without needing distraction, that you don't panic in silence, that your worth doesn't evaporate when no one is watching. Psychologically, this is a powerful form of self-trust. It doesn't mean these individuals never feel lonely. Loneliness can still appear, especially when meaningful connection is absent, but they don't confuse loneliness with being alone. They know the difference. In relationships, people who prefer being alone tend to seek depth over frequency. They may have fewer connections, but those connections are often intense, loyal, and meaningful. They don't scatter their energy widely. When they choose to invest, they do so fully. This selectivity is sometimes mistaken for aloofness, but it's actually a form of respect. They value connection too much to treat it casually. There's also a strong ethical dimension to solitude preference. Being alone forces confrontation with one's own moral compass. Without group reinforcement, you learn what you believe when no one is applauding. This can make such individuals principled, sometimes uncompromising. They're less likely to follow harmful group dynamics simply because everyone else is doing it. Their decisions are filtered through internal reflection rather than social momentum. Modern psychology increasingly recognizes that solitude is not a flaw to be fixed, but a resource to be managed. For people who prefer being alone, mental health improves when solitude is balanced, intentional, and protected. When alone time is constantly interrupted or devalued, stress rises. When it's respected, these individuals thrive. They become clearer thinkers, calmer communicators, and more authentic versions of themselves. If you're listening to this and feeling that subtle sense of recognition, that feeling of someone finally articulating what you've always known but rarely heard spoken, that's not accidental. It means you're tapping into a deeper understanding of how minds differ. Staying connected to conversations like this isn't about noise. It's about continuity, about exploring layers most people never stop to examine. There's a paradox at the heart of preferring solitude. The more comfortable you are alone, the more genuine your connections tend to be. You're not using others to fill a void. You're choosing them from a place of fullness. This changes the quality of interaction. Conversations become intentional. Presence becomes real. Silence is no longer something to escape, but something you can share. People who prefer being alone often have a heightened awareness of their inner dialogue. They notice patterns in their thoughts, recurring fears, habitual narratives. This self-awareness can be challenging, even uncomfortable, but it's also transformative. You can't change what you refuse to see. Solitude makes seeing unavoidable. Over time, this leads to emotional maturity that doesn't depend on age or status. It's worth noting that this preference isn't static. Life events can intensify or soften it. Trauma can push people towards solitude as protection. Healing can make solitude feel safe again rather than isolating. Growth can expand one's capacity for connection without erasing the need for alone time. Psychology doesn't frame solitude preference as a fixed label, but as a dynamic trait that interacts with experience. The cultural narrative is slowly shifting. More people are beginning to question the assumption that louder equals better, that busier equals more important, that constant connectivity equals happiness. In this shift, the psychology of people who prefer being alone offers valuable insight. It shows that fulfillment doesn't always come from accumulation of friends, events, achievements, but from alignment. Alignment between how you live and how your mind works. There's courage in choosing solitude in a world that equates presence with visibility. There's strength in stepping back when everyone else is pushing forward. And there's wisdom in knowing when to engage and when to retreat. People who prefer being alone often develop this wisdom not because they're taught it, but because solitude teaches it naturally. As this understanding deepens, something interesting happens. The shame often associated with preferring solitude begins to dissolve. It's replaced by discernment. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "What do I need?" That shift is psychologically profound. It moves you from self-judgment to self-knowledge. If you've ever felt pressure to be more social than feels natural, to fill your calendar just to prove something, to apologize for needing space, this perspective reframes everything. Your preference for being alone isn't a deficit. It's information. It tells you how your mind restores itself, how your emotions settle, how your sense of meaning forms. Ignoring it doesn't make you stronger. Honoring it does. And here's the quiet truth most people never say out loud. Many of the world's most insightful ideas, ethical breakthroughs, and creative leaps were born in solitude. Not in isolation from humanity, but in conversation with oneself. People who prefer being alone are often having that conversation constantly, refining it, deepening it, listening closely. That inner dialogue becomes their compass. If this exploration is resonating, it's because you're already tuned to these subtleties. Continuing to explore them is less about learning something new and more about remembering what you've always felt. Staying with that curiosity, that depth, that willingness to look inward is how understanding compounds. In the end, the psychology of people who prefer being alone isn't about withdrawal, it's about intention. It's about choosing environments that support mental clarity. It's about valuing depth over noise. It's about trusting that being alone doesn't mean being disconnected, but being connected differently. And once you see that, once you truly understand it, solitude stops feeling like something to explain and starts feeling like something to respect. And if you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who values depth over distraction, someone who doesn't just skim the surface of ideas. Staying close to explorations like this isn't about obligation. It's about belonging to a quieter, more thoughtful way of seeing the world.